Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Silver Vow. The needle didn't just pierce the skin, it felt like it was threading liquid ice directly into Herman's marrow. He gripped the edge of the surgical table, his knuckles turning a porcelain white as the mercury-derived synthetic flooded his veins. It was a heavy, silver poison designed to do one thing: kill the Omega within him. "Steady, Agent Morse," the technician whispered, checking the vitals on a glowing monitor. "The cinnamon is fading. Your pulse is flattening. Within the hour, you'll be as cold as the artillery you're sent to fix." Herman didn't nod. He couldn't. He was already practicing the vow of silence, the monastic cover story that would be his only shield inside the Alpha Garrison. By the time he stood up, his scent was gone, replaced by the sterile, metallic tang of the suppressant. He was no longer a person, he was a precision instrument. The Alpha Garrison didn't just house soldiers, it breathed them. The air was thick with the musk of dominant alphas, sweat, gunpowder, and the aggressive pheromones of men bred for conquest. To any other Omega, the atmosphere would have been a physical blow to the chest. To Herman, shielded by the silver in his blood, it was merely data. He walked through the reinforced durasteel gates, carrying nothing but a small toolkit and a leather-bound notepad tucked into his belt. Herman Morse? The silent specialist from the tech sect? The voice was like low-frequency thunder. Herman stopped. General Deandre Fox stood at the center of the yard, flanked by two lieutenants. He was a mountain of a man, his uniform pressed with a sharpness that could draw blood. Unlike the others, Deandre wore no scent blockers. He didn't need to. He let the world know exactly who he was: sandalwood and cedar, a grounding, earthy scent that seemed to claim the very oxygen around him. Herman looked up, meeting the general's amber eyes. He didn't flinch. He simply bowed his head in a shallow, respectful arc. "Not much for words, are you?" Deandre stepped closer, his shadow falling over Herman like a shroud. "Fine. My men say the Type 4 railgun in Bay 7 is unfixable. They say the firing pin is haunted. If you're as good as your credentials claim, have it ready for live fire by sunset. If not, you're on the first transport back to the monastery." The workshop was a cathedral of grease and iron. The Type 4 railgun sat disassembled on the maglift, a massive, stubborn beast of a weapon. The garrison's engineers stood back, crossing their arms, waiting for the frail monk to fail. Herman didn't look at them. He clicked open his toolkit. His fingers moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. He didn't use the standard manual, he felt the tension in the springs, the minute misalignments in the magnetic rails. He climbed onto the housing, his body draped over the cold steel, his ear pressed to the casing as he tapped a rhythmic code against the metal. Clang. Tap. Shoo. He found the hitch, a microscopic burr on the primary accelerator. With a jeweler's file, he smoothed it away. Then, he reached for his notepad and scribbled a single sentence in precise, architectural script. "Initiate sequence. It will not jam again." "Big talk for a man who can't speak," one of the engineers scoffed, reaching for the ignition toggle. The railgun hummed. The power surged through the coils with a clean, high-pitched whine that hadn't been heard in weeks. It fired a dummy slug with a crack of displaced air that shattered the glass in the observation booth. Silence followed. Real, heavy silence. Herman didn't celebrate. He began wiping the grease from his fingers with a rag, his expression a mask of silver-cold indifference. He didn't notice Deandre Fox standing in the shadows of the bay door. He didn't notice the way the general's nostrils flared, searching for a scent that wasn't there, or the way Deandre's gaze lingered on the pulse point of Herman's neck, where a small, hidden patch hummed against a frantic, hidden heart. "Impressive," Deandre said, his voice closer than Herman expected. Herman turned. The general was inches away. The scent of sandalwood hit Herman like a physical wave, threatening to melt the mercury in his veins. For a split second, Herman's pupils dilated, a biological reflex he couldn't kill. Deandre reached out, his gloved fingers hovering just an inch from Herman's jaw. "You're a strange one, Morse. Let's see if you can handle my personal armory tomorrow." Herman bowed again, his eyes lowered, while inside his chest, the Omega spy screamed in a voice no one would ever hear. Chapter 2, Sandalwood and Steel. The transition from the communal grease of Bay 7 to the General's private armory was like moving from a battlefield into a sanctuary. Here, the air was cooler, filtered, and saturated, not with the metallic tang of the garrison, but with the thick, unapologetic presence of Deandre Fox. Herman's boots clicked on the polished obsidian floors. He felt the phantom weight of the mercury in his veins, a heavy, sluggish coldness that was supposed to keep his reactions clinical. But as the heavy blast doors hissed shut behind him, the isolation felt like a trap. Deandre didn't look up from the workbench. He was stripped to a dark olive undershirt, his muscular arms slick with a light sheen of sweat as he wrestled with a disassembled pulse cannon. The scent of sandalwood and warm skin hit Herman like a physical wall. It was grounding, earthy, and, to an Omega's suppressed biology, territorial. Herman stood at a respectful distance, his hands folded into his sleeves, waiting. "You're late, Morse," Deandre said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in the floorboards. "By 3 minutes. In my armory, 3 minutes is the difference between a successful strike and a body bag." Herman didn't flinch. He reached for his belt, pulled out his small leather notepad, and scribbled with a charcoal pencil. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate and silent, and placed the note on the edge of the workbench. The magnetic stabilizers in the corridor were misaligned. "I corrected them on the way." Deandre paused, finally looking up. His amber eyes swept over Herman, trailing from the sharp line of his jaw down to the high collar of his tunic. A small, amused smirk tugged at the corner of the General's mouth. "Efficient. Even when it's not your job." Deandre stepped back, gesturing to the pulse cannon. "This is the Widowmaker. The recoil is tearing the shoulder mounts off my lead strikers. Recalibrate the dampeners. I want it smooth enough for a scout to fire, but lethal enough to punch through a dreadnought." Herman moved in. To work on the Widowmaker, he had to stand where Deandre had just been. The metal was still warm from the General's touch. As Herman worked, Deandre didn't leave. He leaned against a nearby equipment rack, crossing his massive arms, watching Herman's fingers. Herman felt the scrutiny like a heat lamp. His fingers, usually steady as a surgeon's, felt a microscopic tremor. "Suppress," he commanded himself. "Blood is mercury. Heart is stone." The dampener required a two-man lift to seat the primary coil. Herman braced himself, his slight frame straining against the dead weight of the alloy. Before he could struggle, a shadow loomed over him. Deandre reached around Herman, his chest nearly brushing Herman's back, to grip the other side of the coil. The General's heat was a sudden, violent intrusion. The scent of sandalwood intensified, swirling around Herman's senses, searching for a crack in the cinnamon-scented armor that wasn't there. "Steady," Deandre murmured, his breath ghosting over the shell of Herman's ear. "I've got the weight. You just guide the pin." Herman's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic pulse that his internal monitors would surely flag as a stress event. He could feel the solid wall of Deandre's pectoral muscles behind him. For a moment, the cold mercury in his blood felt like it was starting to boil. Herman slid the pin into place with a sharp clack. He stepped away immediately, his breath hitching in his throat, and grabbed his notepad. His handwriting was slightly less precise than usual. "The dampener is seated. It will hold." Deandre looked at the note, then at Herman. He didn't move back. He stayed in Herman's personal space, his gaze dropping to the high, stiff collar that hid Herman's scent glands. "You don't smell like the others, Morse," Deandre said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, private register. "Most Omegas, even the ones on heavy blockers, have a hollow scent. A void where their nature used to be." You? You smell like nothing. Just cold steel and ozone. Herman met his gaze, his expression a mask of monastic devotion. He tapped his throat, then gestured to the notepad, a silent reminder of his vow. Is that what it is? A vow? Deandre stepped an inch closer. He reached out, his thumb grazing the fabric of Herman's collar. The contact was electric. Or are you just hiding something so potent it would bring this whole garrison to its knees? Herman didn't move. He couldn't. He simply watched the general, his silver-laden blood fighting a war against the sandalwood-scented gravity of the man before him. Deandre finally pulled his hand away, but the intensity in his eyes didn't fade. Finish the calibration. I'll be back at 0600. Don't be late again, specialist. As the door closed, Herman slumped against the workbench, his hand flying to his throat. He could still feel the phantom heat of Deandre's thumb. He pulled his notepad out and wrote one word, pressing so hard the lead snapped. Dangerous. Chapter 3, The First Leak. The garrison's proving grounds were a desolate stretch of scorched earth and reinforced concrete. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a storm that matched the atmospheric tension on the ground. Herman stood in the technician's pit, a narrow trench shielded by 6 inches of armored glass. Today was the final validation for the Type 4 railgun, the haunted beast he had supposedly tamed. Deandre stood atop the command dais, a silhouette of absolute authority. He didn't look at the targets. He looked down into the pit, his amber eyes locked on Herman. Through the comms, his voice was a low, crackling rasp. Specialist Morse. Initiate the sequence. Herman pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner. The railgun roared to life, its magnetic coils glowing a fierce, radioactive blue. The vibration rattled Herman's teeth, humming through the mercury in his bones. It happened in a microsecond. A feedback loop, caused not by Herman's work but by a faulty power cell in the garrison's aging grid, sent a surge back into the primary chamber. Warning, containment breach, the mechanical voice droned. Herman didn't run. If the railgun detonated, the entire command dais, and Deandre, would be vaporized. He vaulted over the trench wall, ignoring the shouts of the soldiers, and dove toward the manual vent. The heat was blistering. As he wrenched the emergency lever, a pressurized coolant line snapped. The jagged edge of the alloy pipe slashed across Herman's forearm, deep and clean. The railgun groaned, the blue glow fading into a safe, dull hum. The catastrophe was averted. But as Herman slumped against the cooling metal, he saw the fluid dripping from his sleeve. It wasn't red. It was a shimmering, viscous silver, the mercury suppressant, streaked with the dark crimson of his true blood. Morse. Deandre was there before the medics, leaping from the dais with a grace that belied his size. He grabbed Herman's shoulder, hauling him upright. Don't move, Deandre commanded, his voice tight. He reached for Herman's arm, his large hand clamping over the wound to stem the flow. Then, the general froze. The synthetic suppressant, when exposed to the air and the heat of the railgun, began to oxidize. It gave off a sharp, ozone-like sting, but beneath it, the deep cut was venting something else. Without the mercury to hold it back, a sharp, panicked spike of pure cinnamon escaped. It was faint, a ghost of a scent, but to an alpha like Deandre, it was a flare in the dark. Deandre's nostrils flared. His grip on Herman's arm tightened until it was nearly painful. He leaned in, his face inches from Herman's neck, his senses working with a predatory intensity. What is this? Deandre whispered, his voice dangerously low. Herman's heart was a drum, frantic and loud. He scrambled for his notepad, but his hands were slick with the silver-red mess. He simply looked up at Deandre, his eyes wide, his breath hitching. He couldn't speak, and for the first time, his silence felt like a confession. The garrison medics rushed forward with a hovering gurney. General, let us take him. That's a grade 3 laceration, he needs I'll carry him, Deandre snapped, his eyes never leaving Herman's. He lifted Herman as if he weighed nothing. As they moved toward the infirmary, Herman felt the sandalwood scent of the general wrap around him, protective and possessive. But it wasn't the comfort that terrified Herman, it was the way Deandre was looking at the silver blood staining his own gloves. In the sterile light of the hallway, Deandre didn't hand him over to the doctors. He pulled a medic aside. Patch him. Stitches only. No blood work. No systemic scans. Do you understand? The medic blinked, confused. But General, the protocol for chemical exposure. I am the protocol, Deandre growled. He stayed in the room while they stitched Herman's arm. He sat in a chair by the door, arms crossed, watching the way the silver fluid eventually stopped leaking, replaced by normal, human red. When the medics finished and left them alone, the silence was suffocating. Deandre stood up and walked to the bed. He picked up Herman's blood-stained notepad from the side table and handed it to him. You're going to want to explain that, Deandre said, pointing to the silver smear on the floor. And you're going to want to explain why, for 1 second out there, you smelled like a spice market in the middle of a war zone. Herman took the pen. His hand shook. He wrote. Experimental Texect augmentations. My blood is treated for radiation resistance. Deandre stared at the note for a long time. He didn't believe it. Herman could see the gears turning behind those amber eyes, the suspicion clashing with the undeniable pull he felt toward the mute specialist. Radiation resistance, Deandre repeated, a dark smile playing on his lips. He leaned over the bed, pinning Herman in place with his shadow. Then you won't mind if I keep a closer eye on your augmentations from now on. Chapter 4, The Language of Hands. The infirmary had been a warning, but the armory became a confessional. Herman's arm was bandaged in thick, white gauze, the silver mercury once again stabilized beneath his skin by a double dose of suppressants. The chill in his veins was absolute now, a numbing frost that should have made him untouchable. But as he stepped into Deandre's private workshop for his morning shift, he found the general waiting not with a weapon, but with a stack of heavy, cream-colored vellum. Deandre didn't speak. He simply pointed to the workbench. Resting next to a disassembled recoil compensator was a fountain pen and a fresh sheet of paper. Deandre had already written the first line in a bold, sweeping script that looked like it had been carved into the page. The medics say you should be resting. I say the long-range array is lagging by 0.4 seconds. Which of us is right? Herman felt a strange flutter in his chest, not the frantic pulse of a spy, but something softer. He picked up the pen. The nib was gold, smooth, and bled ink like silk. The medics are paid to be cautious. I am paid to be precise. The lag is in the optic relay, not the array. Deandre leaned over the bench to read the reply. He didn't pull away this time. Instead, he took the pen from Herman's hand, his fingers lingering against Herman's skin for a second longer than necessary. Show me. The next 3 hours passed in a rhythmic, mechanical trance. They didn't exchange a single vocal word, yet the room was filled with the sound of their collaboration, the clink of wrenches, the hiss of pressurized air, and the scratch of the pen on vellum. Whenever a technical hurdle arose, they pushed the paper back and forth. What started as a functional necessity quickly spiraled into something more intimate. Deandre, you handle that plasma cutter like you were born with it. Where did a monk learn to weld like a god? Herman, the sect teaches that machines have souls. To weld is to mend a spirit. My God is the calibration dial. Deandre let out a short, huffed laugh, the first genuine sound Herman had heard from him that wasn't a command. Deandre, then my spirit is in dire need of mending, specialist. This war, it's a grinding machine that eats men and spits out ash. I'm tired of the gears. Herman paused, his salt iron midair. He looked at Deandre. The general wasn't looking at the weapons. He was staring out the small, reinforced porthole at the gray, smog-choked horizon of the garrison. The Alpha General was gone for a moment, replaced by a man who looked profoundly lonely. Herman hesitated, then wrote. Gears can be replaced. Ash cannot. Why do you keep fighting if the machine is broken? Deandre took the paper. He stared at Herman's question for a long time. His scent, usually a sharp, aggressive sandalwood, softened into something warmer, like old books and sun-drenched wood. Deandre, because if I stop, someone more cruel takes the lever. I stay so I can eventually turn the machine off. As the sun began to set, casting long, amber shadows across the workshop, the nature of their communication shifted. Deandre stopped writing. He watched Herman's hands, the way the long, scarred fingers moved with such delicacy over the wires. Deandre reached out and gently caught Herman's left hand, turning it over to look at the bandage on his forearm. With his other hand, he began to trace patterns on Herman's palm. It wasn't sign language. It was a tactile conversation. Are you hurt? The pressure of his thumb seemed to ask. Are you real? Herman's breath hitched. He knew he should pull away. Every second he spent in this bubble of shared silence was a second he was failing his mission. He was supposed to be rigging the garrison's core, not tracing the lifelines of its commander. Instead of retreating, Herman used his free hand to grab the pen one last time. The lag is fixed. The optics are clear now. Deandre read the note, then looked directly into Herman's eyes. He didn't let go of Herman's hand. I can see everything now, Herman, Deandre whispered, breaking the silence of the room. His voice was a velvet caress. Even the things you aren't writing down. Herman pulled his hand back, his heart hammering a warning against his ribs. He bowed low, gathered his notepad, and retreated toward the door. As he left, he realized with a jolt of terror that he hadn't thought about the sabotage once in the last 4 hours. The mercury was failing. The man was getting in. Chapter 5, The Lingering Touch. The air in the private armory had grown stagnant, thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, grounding scent of Deandre's sandalwood. It was late, past the hour when the garrison's hum usually settled into a low thrum, but the general's personal long-range sniper rifle lay disassembled on the workbench, a skeletal beast of matte black alloy. Herman's fingers were steady as he worked, but his mind was a fractured mess. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the thermal schematics of the garrison's core, the target he was supposed to be rigging for total collapse. The optic sensor is misaligned by a hair, Deandre said, his voice a low rumble from just behind Herman's shoulder. Herman didn't turn. He reached for a microcalibrator, his hand hovering over the delicate lens. But as he leaned in to adjust the glass, Deandre didn't move away. He stepped closer, his chest nearly pressing into Herman's back. Let me, Deandre whispered. He didn't wait for Herman to move. He reached around him, his large, calloused hands covering Herman's smaller ones on the rifle's housing. The physical contact was like a short circuit. The heat from Deandre's skin seared through Herman's sleeves, a violent contrast to the synthetic chill of the mercury in his veins. Herman's breath hitched, caught in the back of his throat. He tried to pull his hands away, but Deandre's grip tightened, not aggressively, but with a firm, steadying weight. Steady, the general murmured. If you flinch now, the lens cracks. Deandre's face was inches from Herman's neck. Herman could feel the radiating warmth of the Alpha's breath hitting the thin skin just behind his ear, the exact location of his primary scent blocker implant. Inside Herman's body, the mercury reached its boiling point. The stress of the mission, the physical exhaustion, and the overwhelming proximity of a dominant Alpha's pheromones finally forced a crack in his chemical armor. The high-end blocker, embedded just beneath his skin, hummed with a sudden, sharp vibration. It couldn't compensate for the surge of cortisol and genuine attraction. Pop. It was a sound only Herman heard, a microscopic failure of the seal. Suddenly, the sterile, metallic void around Herman's body shattered. Like a dam breaking, the scent of warm cinnamon and toasted sugar flooded the small workspace. It wasn't the faint ghost from the accident at the firing range, it was a concentrated, feverish bloom of a hidden Omega in distress. Deandre froze. His hands, still covering Herman's, went rigid. The general's nostrils flared, drawing in the sudden, sweet electricity in the air. The sandalwood scent of the room transformed instantly, sharpening into something dark, possessive, and predatory. Herman's eyes went wide. He lunged forward, breaking the general's hold and stumbling toward the chemical wash station. He grabbed a bottle of industrial-grade solvent, appending it over his hands and sleeves with a frantic, splashing mess. The stinging smell of alcohol and ammonia tore through the room, fighting to drown out the cinnamon. Herman grabbed his notepad, his hand shaking so violently the pencil lead snapped twice before he could finish a sentence. Chemical spill. The coolant in the rifle's housing is volatile. I must clean the station immediately. He didn't look up. He kept scrubbing at the workbench, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched as if to hide his very existence. Herman. The voice wasn't a command. It was a question, weighted with a terrifying realization. Deandre walked toward him, his boots heavy on the obsidian floor. He stopped just behind Herman, but he didn't touch him this time. He didn't need to. The air between them was vibrating with a truth that no amount of industrial solvent could fully erase. That wasn't coolant, Deandre said, his voice dropping to a jagged, private whisper. I know the smell of every chemical in this garrison. I know the smell of every alloy we forge. He leaned down, his shadow swallowing Herman whole. That was you. Herman squeezed his eyes shut, his heart beating so hard against his ribs it felt like it might shatter the mercury-soaked bones. He kept scrubbing, his knuckles raw, as he realized the general wasn't just looking at a weapons expert anymore. He was looking at a ghost, and he was finally starting to see the shape of the man underneath. Chapter 6, The Shadow of the Spy. The high-vibration hum of the neural link was no longer a background noise, it was a rhythmic drilling against the inside of Herman's skull. As he sat in his Spartan quarters, the transmission from his handlers pulsed in a jagged, red-coded burst. Protocol Mercury is compromised. Status, stagnant. Objective, retrieve Command Alpha codes. Deadline, 0400. Fail, and the extraction is scrubbed. You will be left to the Alphas. Herman gripped the edge of his narrow cot. The threat was clear. If he didn't move now, he was a dead man, either executed by the garrison as a spy or abandoned by his own people to burn in the coming invasion. The garrison at night was a skeletal labyrinth of blue emergency lights and shifting shadows. Herman moved like a ghost, his boots silenced by specialized saws, his heart rate artificially flattened by a temporary chemical surge. He didn't need a flashlight. He had memorized the layout of the command center weeks ago. He slipped through the ventilation shafts, his slender frame sliding through the narrow ducts with the grace of a serpent. When he dropped into the war room, the silence was absolute. He approached the primary console, Deandre's terminal. His fingers danced over the holographic interface. He didn't use a hack tool, he used the manual overrides he had repaired only days prior. He was rewriting the security permissions when a soft, mechanical hiss echoed through the room. The main blast doors were opening. Herman froze, his hand hovering over the data core. He couldn't hide, the room was an open expanse of glass and steel. He did the only thing he could, he pulled a diagnostic tablet from his belt and began scrolling through dummy schematics, forcing his face into a mask of professional obsession. Deandre Fox stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing his formal tunic. He was in a simple black compression shirt that showed the restless tension in his shoulders. He didn't look surprised to see Herman. He looked expectant. Working late, specialist? Deandre's voice carried no warmth this time. It was the voice of a general conducting an interrogation. Herman didn't look up immediately. He finished a calculation on his tablet, then turned and bowed. He reached for his notepad, his movements slow and deliberate. The atmospheric sensors in the east wing were fluctuating. I came to check the master grid for a surge. Deandre walked toward him, his boots thudding with a slow, predatory rhythm. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of the console, his hip brushing against the edge of the desk where the stolen data core was currently downloading. A surge, Deandre repeated. He leaned over, his face inches from Herman's. The scent of sandalwood was cold now, sharp like a winter forest. Strange. Because I've been watching the logs. There is no surge, Herman. There is only a shadow moving through my systems. Deandre reached out, his hand wrapping around Herman's nape. It wasn't a caress. It was a claim. He forced Herman to look at him, their eyes locking in the dim blue light. I know what you are, Deandre whispered, his voice a jagged edge. I smelled the cinnamon. I saw the silver blood. And now, I see you standing at my terminal in the dead of night. Herman's pulse spiked. He could feel the neural link in his brain screaming, lethal force authorized. Eliminate the target. His hand drifted toward the concealed ceramic blade in his sleeve. He could kill Deandre. He was trained for it. One strike to the carotid, and the mission would be secure. But as his fingers touched the hilt, Deandre's grip on his neck softened. The general's thumb traced the line of Herman's jaw, a gesture of profound, agonizing vulnerability. Tell me why, Deandre pleaded, his voice breaking the Alpha facade. Give me one reason to believe you aren't here to destroy us. Write it down. Give me a lie I can live with, and I'll let you walk out of this room. Herman looked at the man he was supposed to betray. He saw the exhaustion in Deandre's eyes, the hope that was being crushed by duty. Herman's hand dropped away from the blade. He picked up his pen. His hand shook as he wrote a single line. I am here because I have nowhere else to go. Deandre stared at the note. He let out a long, ragged breath and released Herman's neck. He didn't check the terminal. He didn't call the guards. He simply turned his back, staring out at the dark horizon. Go, Deandre said. Before I regain my senses. Herman grabbed the data core and fled. As he sprinted back to his quarters, the mercury in his veins felt like lead. He had the codes. The mission was a success. But as he looked at his trembling hands, he knew he had just lost the only thing that made him feel human. Chapter 7: The Heat of the Forge. The ambient temperature in the forge was always high, but today it felt subterranean, a crushing, humid weight that made the mercury in Herman's veins feel like it was turning to steam. He was alone in the deep workshop, supposed to be finalizing the adjustments to the garrison's power grid. Instead, he was slumped against a cooling vent, his skin slick with a cold, unnatural sweat. The command Alpha code sat like a lead weight in his pocket, a ticking clock of betrayal. His neural link was misfiring, sending jagged shocks of static through his brain. The mercury treatment was designed for a cold machine, not a man whose heart was tearing itself in two. The chemical suppressants were designed to mask scent, but they couldn't mask the soul's exhaustion. Herman's vision blurred. The blue holographic schematics danced before his eyes, turning into smears of light. He reached for his water ration, but his hand spasmed, the bottle clattering to the obsidian floor. He tried to stand, to find the emergency injector in his kit, but his knees buckled. He slid down the wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Warning, biological spike detected. Suppression failing, the internal voice of his mission comms hissed in his ear. He didn't care. The cold was finally leaving him, replaced by a terrifying, incandescent heat. The heavy blast doors of the forge hissed open. Herman didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air shifted instantly, the sharp, grounding scent of sandalwood cutting through the forge's smog like a blade. Deandre didn't call out. He moved with a silent, urgent speed, his boots echoing on the metal floor. When he found Herman collapsed in the shadow of the primary furnace, he didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, his massive hands reaching out to steady Herman's trembling shoulders. Herman? Look at me. Herman lifted his head, but his eyes were glassy, his pupils blown wide. The vow of silence was no longer a choice, his throat was too tight with fever to make a sound. Then, it happened. The final barrier of the mercury treatment dissolved. It wasn't a slow leak this time, it was a volcanic eruption. The scent of pure, unadulterated cinnamon, sweet, spicy, and desperately inviting, exploded into the small space. It was the scent of an omega in a suppressed heat, a biological SOS that bypassed every logical defense. Deandre's breath hitched. His pupils bled into the amber of his irises, his alpha instincts flaring in a violent, protective surge. The sandalwood scent of the general deepened, turning smoky and dark, wrapping around Herman like a physical embrace. God, Deandre rasped, his voice a low, primal growl. He pulled Herman into his lap, ignoring the grease and the soot. He pressed his face into the crook of Herman's neck, inhaling the honesty of the scent he had hunted for weeks. "You're burning up." Herman's hand scrambled at Deandre's chest, his fingers bunching the fabric of the general's black undershirt. He wasn't trying to push him away, he was trying to pull him closer, his body seeking the grounding stability of the Alpha's strength. The mercury was gone. For the first time since he had crossed the border, Herman felt warm. Deandre lifted him, cradling him against his chest as he stood. He didn't head for the infirmary. He knew the medics would see the truth, and he knew what the garrison did to spies. He headed for the only place that was safe, his private quarters. As they moved through the service tunnels, Herman's head rested against Deandre's collarbone. He could hear the general's heart, a steady, thunderous drum. Herman reached into his pocket with a trembling hand. He pulled out his notepad, his movements sluggish. He didn't have the strength for a sentence. He simply wrote one word in large, messy letters before the pen slipped from his fingers. "Stay." Deandre looked down at the note, his grip tightening. He kicked open the door to his quarters and locked it behind them, shutting out the world of steel and war. "I'm not going anywhere, Herman," Deandre whispered into his hair, his voice thick with a promise that felt like treason. "The machine can burn. I'm staying right here." In the dim light of the general's room, the scent of cinnamon and sandalwood finally fused, creating a new atmosphere, one where the spy and the general didn't exist, leaving only two men caught in the heat of a forge they couldn't escape. Chapter 8, The Lethal Choice. The cool artificial air of Deandre's quarters did little to dampen the fever burning in Herman's blood. He lay on the general's bed, the scent of sandalwood ingrained in the sheets, a sensory sanctuary that made the mission feel like a nightmare from another life. But the nightmare had a digital pulse. The neural link behind Herman's ear gave a sharp, agonizing prick. T-15 minutes to core destabilization. Extraction point, North Hangar. Detonate and evacuate. Herman sat up, his movements jerky and stiff. The mercury was fighting to re-establish its cold grip, but the warmth of Deandre's lingering touch made the transition feel like being flayed alive. He looked at the command alpha codes glowing on his discarded tablet. One keystroke would trigger the cascade. The garrison's shields would drop, the reactor would vent, and thousands of alphas, including the man currently standing at the window watching the horizon, would be caught in the fire. Deandre turned. He hadn't touched the weapons on his belt since they entered the room. He looked at Herman, his expression one of profound, weary clarity. "I checked the logs after I brought you here, Herman," Deandre said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "The surge you were looking for. It wasn't a surge. It was a countdown." Herman froze. He reached for his notepad, but his fingers couldn't find the pen. "Don't," Deandre said, walking toward the bed. He sat on the edge, the mattress dipping under his weight. He didn't reach for his gun, he reached for Herman's hand, lacing their fingers together. No more notes. No more silence. Herman's throat worked, the muscles tight and unused. He had spent years suppressing his voice, his scent, his very soul. "They're coming," Herman rasped. His voice was a ghost of a sound, dry, cracked, and fragile like autumn leaves. The core. It's already begun. Deandre didn't flinch. He squeezed Herman's hand, his thumb tracing the scars on Herman's knuckles. I know. The alarms will trip in 3 minutes. My officers will come for you. They'll see the spy, and they'll see the general who let him in. Deandre pulled a small, silver detonator from his own pocket, the manual override for the garrison's failsafes. He placed it in Herman's open palm. You have 2 missions, Herman, Deandre whispered, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. 1, you trigger the collapse, you kill me, and you go back to your people as a hero. 2, you use those codes to lock the core, you kill the signal to your handlers, and you become a traitor to everyone but me. Herman looked down at the silver device. The cinnamon scent was faint now, fading back into the metallic void of the mercury, but his heart was screaming. To choose Deandre was to invite a slow death, a life on the run from an empire that didn't forgive. To choose the mission was to survive, but to lose the only man who had ever truly seen him. The red emergency lights began to pulse in the corridor. The low-frequency klaxon of the garrison began to wail. Core breach imminent. All personnel to evacuation stations. Herman looked at the terminal, then back at Deandre. The general wasn't fighting. He was waiting. He was giving an Omega spy the power to destroy his world, simply because he preferred a beautiful end to a hollow life. Herman's fingers closed around the detonator. I can't let you die, Herman whispered, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. He didn't trigger the explosion. Instead, his fingers flew across the tablet, his expertise turning from sabotage to salvation. He began rewriting the core's logic, weaving a dead man switch that would fake a total meltdown to the outside world while secretly hardening the garrison's internal shells. What are you doing? Deandre asked, his breath catching. I'm choosing a third path, Herman said, his eyes flashing with a silver-sharp intelligence. I'm killing the spy. And I'm taking the general with me. As the first blast shook the floor, a controlled explosion Herman had set to mask their escape, Herman grabbed Deandre's collar and pulled him into a hard, desperate kiss. It tasted of cinnamon and salt, a lethal, heart-wrenching goodbye to the men they were supposed to be. Chapter 9, The Silent Peace. The snow and the high pass didn't smell like iron or gunpowder. It smelled like nothing at all, a vast, white silence that swallowed the sound of the wind. Nestled into the jagged spine of the neutral territories, a small stone cottage clung to the cliffside. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of pine resin and the steady, rhythmic tick-tock of 100 different hearts. Herman sat at a workbench by the window, a jeweler's loupe pressed to his eye. He wasn't calibrating railguns or rigging thermal cores. He was delicately placing a hairspring into the guts of a vintage chronometer. The mercury was long gone from his veins, purged by months of grueling detox and the healing heat of a life lived in the sun. The bell above the shop door chimed. Herman didn't look up immediately. He finished seating the spring, his hands rock steady. He didn't need suppressants anymore, his scent was his own now, a soft, settled cinnamon that hummed contentedly in the small room. A heavy pair of boots crunched across the floorboards. The newcomer didn't speak, but the air in the shop shifted. The earthy, grounding scent of sandalwood and cedar filled the space, chasing away the chill of the mountain air. Deandre Fox, no longer a general, wearing a rugged shearling coat instead of a high-collared uniform, stood at the counter. He placed a small, battered metal casing on the wood. The regulator on the hydro pump is dragging again, Deandre said. His voice was no longer a command, it was a low, intimate rumble that made Herman's pulse skip a beat out of habit, not fear. Herman finally looked up. He set his tools down and reached for his leather-bound notepad. It was a new one, the pages clean and white. He wrote in his elegant, architectural script. You're pushing the machine too hard, Deandre. It's a pump, not a garrison turbine. Deandre laughed, a sound that was full and bright. He reached across the counter, his large hand covering Herman's. The touch was familiar now, no longer a lingering threat, but a constant anchor. Old habits, Deandre admitted, his thumb tracing the faint scar on Herman's forearm where the silver blood had once leaked. I forget that we aren't at war anymore. Herman stood and walked around the counter. He didn't need to write a reply for this. He stepped into Deandre's space, resting his forehead against the man's chest. He closed his eyes, inhaling the sandalwood, letting it wrap around him like a shield that would never break. He had faked his death in the fire of the garrison's meltdown, and Deandre had used the chaos to retire into the shadows of the frontier. To the world, they were ghosts. To each other, they were the only things that were real. Herman pulled back slightly, his fingers flying in the quick, fluid motions of sign language, a language they had perfected in their months of exile. "You are late," he signed, his eyes sparkling with a quiet mischief. "The tea is cold." Deandre smiled, leaning down to press a kiss to the crown of Herman's head. The snow was deep in the valley. I had to clear the path for the trade caravan. Herman reached for his notepad one last time, writing a single line before closing it and setting the pen aside for the evening. "Then let the path stay open. We aren't going anywhere." As the sun dipped below the peaks, casting a long, violet shadow over the valley, the two men sat on the porch of the cottage. There were no alarms, no neural links, and no suppressed scents. Herman leaned his head on Deandre's shoulder. His voice was still rare, a precious thing he used only in the dark of night when the world was perfectly still, but his silence was no longer a cage. It was a choice. The Omega spy had found his peace. The Alpha General had found his home. And in the high, cold air of the mountains, the scent of cinnamon and sandalwood finally belonged to no one but themselves. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow. See you in the next story.